March 1945. Western Germany. The front has already passed, but the signs of war remain: burned vehicles along the roadside, abandoned equipment half buried in mud, and columns of prisoners moving toward American lines. At the edge of a field camp, a young German soldier is brought in. He is barely 18. His uniform is torn, his face exhausted, but it is his arm that draws immediate attention. It hangs stiff at his side, dark, unnaturally dark. An American medic steps forward and carefully removes the sleeve. The skin beneath is discolored, spreading black from the forearm toward the hand. The medic pauses. He has seen this before, and he knows what it means. This is not just an injury. It is a race against time. And to understand how a young soldier could reach this point, we must return to the final months of an army that could no longer save its own wounded. By early 1945, the German army was no longer operating as a coordinated force. It was breaking apart. Only months earlier, in December 1944, Germany had launched its final major offensive in the West, the Ardennes Offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge. The objective was ambitious: split Allied forces, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The attack failed. By January 1945, German forces were pushed back with heavy losses. Fuel shortages, lack of reinforcements, and overwhelming Allied air power made further large-scale offensives impossible. From that point onward, the war became a retreat. In the east, the Soviet Red Army advanced rapidly toward Berlin, destroying entire German formations. In the west, American and British forces pushed across France and into Germany itself. The pressure came from both directions, and the German military could no longer respond effectively. One of the most critical failures was in medical support. Earlier in the war, the German army had maintained an organized system for treating wounded soldiers: field medics, aid stations, and hospitals behind the lines. But by 1945, this system had largely collapsed. Medical units were understaffed. Supplies were depleted. Transportation was unreliable. Wounded soldiers often could not be evacuated in time. The destruction of railways and roads meant that ambulances struggled to move. Hospitals were overwhelmed or destroyed by bombing. Doctors were forced to make impossible decisions: who could be treated and who would be left behind. In many cases, wounded soldiers remained where they fell. Others attempted to move on their own. Some walked. Some were carried. Some simply waited. For injuries involving broken bones or open wounds, delay was dangerous. But for infections, delay could be fatal. Without proper treatment, bacteria spread quickly through damaged tissue. Dirt, debris, and fragments from explosions contaminated wounds. Without antibiotics limited in Germany compared to Allied supplies, there was little to stop the infection once it began. Penicillin, widely used by American forces by 1945, was not available to German troops in sufficient quantities. The result was predictable. Infections worsened. Wounds that might have healed in days under proper care began to deteriorate over weeks. Swelling increased, pain intensified, and in the most severe cases, tissue began to die. The arm of a wounded soldier left untreated, exposed to cold, dirt, and continuous movement could slowly turn from injured to infected, and from infected to something far more dangerous. At the same time, the German army itself was changing. By 1945, many units were no longer composed of experienced veterans. They were filled with young recruits, teenagers, boys as young as 17 or 18, pulled into service as the war demanded more manpower. These soldiers had less training, less experience, and often less access to support. When they were wounded, their chances of receiving timely medical care were lower than ever before. And so, by the time Allied forces began capturing large numbers of German soldiers in the final months of the war, they were not only encountering defeated troops, they were encountering the consequences of a system that had already begun to fail long before the war officially ended. As the German system faltered, the Allied one moved forward with increasing precision. By 1945, The United States Army had developed a medical structure designed not only for combat but for continuity. It was built to function under pressure, to adapt as the front shifted, and to maintain care even as armies advanced into unfamiliar territory. At its core was triage. Every wounded individual soldier, prisoner, or civilian was assessed quickly. Who could wait? Who required immediate attention? Who could not be saved? These decisions were made within minutes, sometimes seconds. From the front line, casualties were moved through a chain. First contact came from combat medics carrying field dressings, morphine, and plasma. From there, patients were transferred to aid stations and to field hospitals capable of performing surgery close to the front. Behind them stood evacuation hospitals and larger medical facilities, linked by trucks, ambulances, and sometimes aircraft. The system depended on movement, but also on supply. Unlike Germany, the United States maintained steady access to critical resources. Among the most important was penicillin, mass-produced and widely distributed among Allied forces by 1945. For infected wounds, this changed everything. What might have become fatal without treatment could now be contained, but only if treated in time. When Allied forces crossed into Germany in early 1945, their medical units expanded their role. They were no longer treating only their own wounded. They were encountering prisoners, civilians, refugees, and wounded enemy soldiers who had not received care. Field hospitals adapted quickly. Medical tents were set up near prisoner processing areas. Doctors examined incoming individuals not only for identification but for survival. Interpreters helped communicate symptoms. Orderlies moved patients from intake areas to treatment zones. The procedures remained the same: assess, stabilize, treat. But the cases were changing. Allied medics began to see injuries that had progressed far beyond what they were accustomed to handling at early stages. Infections that had been allowed to spread. Wounds that had never been cleaned. Limbs that had been carried for days or weeks without proper care. For these cases, time had already narrowed the available options. The goal was no longer simple recovery. It was containment. Stopping infection before it reached the bloodstream. Preserving as much of the limb as possible. Preventing death. Inside these tents, decisions were made quickly. Examination led directly to action. And when the young German soldier with the blackened arm was brought inside, the medics understood immediately they were not dealing with a recent injury. They were confronting the final stage of something that had been left too long without intervention. From that moment, several perspectives began to unfold the experience of young soldiers in a collapsing army. The nature of untreated battlefield injuries, and the medical decisions that would determine whether this particular life could still be saved. By 1945, the German army no longer resembled the force that had marched across Europe in the early years of the war. Its ranks had changed. Veterans had been lost in earlier campaigns, on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, in Italy. The replacements now filling the lines were younger, less experienced, and often inadequately trained. Many were barely adults, 17, 18, sometimes younger. Some came from the Hitler Youth, mobilized as the war situation worsened. Others were part of newly formed Volksgrenadier divisions, units assembled quickly to replace heavy losses. Training periods were shortened. Equipment was inconsistent. Discipline varied. These young soldiers entered a war that was already being lost. They were sent into defensive positions against advancing Allied forces, often without the support systems that had once sustained the German military. When they were wounded, their chances of survival depended heavily on timing. Earlier in the war, an injured soldier might be evacuated within hours. By 1945, that system was breaking down. Front lines shifted too quickly. Transport routes were damaged or destroyed. Medical personnel were overstretched. For a young soldier with little experience, even recognizing the severity of an injury could be delayed. And by the time help was sought, the window for simple treatment might already have closed. Not all wounds kill immediately. Many begin as survivable injuries. A fracture caused by a fall or explosion. A deep cut from shrapnel. A bullet wound that does not strike vital organs. Under normal conditions, these injuries are treated. The wound is cleaned, bandaged, stabilized. But in the final months of the war, normal conditions no longer existed. Wounded soldiers were often left where they fell either because evacuation was impossible or because units were forced to retreat rapidly. Others attempted to move on their own, carrying their injuries with them as they withdrew toward German territory. Each hour without treatment increased the risk. Dirt entered open wounds. Clothing stuck to damaged skin. Blood circulation weakened. The body attempted to fight infection, but without proper care, it struggled. Movement made everything worse. A soldier walking with an injured arm continues to stress damaged tissue. Without proper immobilization, healing cannot begin. Instead, the injury worsens. In cold conditions, the risk increases further. Winter exposure reduces blood flow to extremities. Frostbite can combine with injury, accelerating tissue damage. The result is a slow progression. Pain, swelling, discoloration, and eventually, it's the point where the body can no longer sustain the affected area. By the time such a soldier reaches medical care days, or even weeks later, the injury has transformed. It is no longer just a wound. It has become a threat to survival. In the final stages of an untreated wound, the body loses control. Bacteria spread through damaged tissue, feeding on cells that can no longer defend themselves. The immune system, already weakened by stress, cold, and malnutrition, struggles to contain the infection. At first, the signs are subtle: redness, warmth, pain. But as the infection deepens, those signs change. Swelling increases. The skin darkens. Circulation begins to fail. When blood can no longer reach the affected area, tissue begins to die. The color shifts from red to purple, then to black. This is gangrene. By the time it reaches this stage, the process is advanced. The danger is no longer local. If bacteria enter the bloodstream, the infection spreads throughout the body. Fever rises. Organs begin to fail. Without intervention, death can follow quickly. For medics, the appearance of a blackened limb is a warning. Time has already been lost. The only question that remains is how much can still be saved. Inside a wartime medical tent, decisions are made quickly. There is no extended consultation, no delay for second opinions. Doctors rely on training, experience, and the evidence in front of them. Color of tissue, presence of pulse, response to touch. The young soldier's arm provides all the information needed. The discoloration shows the spread of damage. The lack of sensation indicates nerve failure. The absence of circulation confirms that part of the limb is no longer viable. The doctor's task is clear. Determine the boundary. Where does the damage end? Where does healthy tissue begin? Because everything below that line may need to be removed. The goal is not to save the arm. It is to save the patient. And that requires acting before the infection crosses into the bloodstream. For the young German soldier, this moment exists in a different context. He has been raised in a system that defined the enemy clearly. American soldiers were not meant to be trusted. Capture was something to fear. Yet here, inside the medical tent, the situation is different. There is no interrogation. No hostility. Only urgency. Doctors examining his arm. Medics preparing equipment. Orders being given with calm precision. The focus is not on who he is. It is on what must be done. In this environment, the boundaries created by war begin to blur. The enemy becomes the patient. The battlefield becomes a place of treatment. And as the medical team prepares to act, the moment reaches its decisive point where survival depends not on allegiance, but on how quickly the damage can be contained. Early March 1945, Western Germany is no longer a defensive line. It is a corridor of retreat. German units fall back under constant pressure. American armored divisions push forward across the Rhine region, supported by overwhelming air power. Roads are filled with movement military vehicles heading east, refugees heading west, and scattered groups of soldiers trying to stay ahead of the advancing front. Command structures are weakening. Orders arrive late, sometimes not at all. Units that once operated as coordinated formations now move in fragments. Officers struggle to maintain control. Communication lines fail as radios are lost or destroyed. For young soldiers, the experience is disorienting. There is no clear front line, no stable position to hold, only movement. Retreat becomes survival. And for the wounded, retreat becomes something else entirely, a test of endurance. The young German soldier had likely been injured days earlier, perhaps during artillery fire, perhaps from shrapnel, perhaps from a fall while moving through damaged terrain. The exact cause matters less than what followed. There was no immediate evacuation, no ambulance, no aid station waiting nearby. Instead, there was distance. Distance from medical care. Distance that had to be crossed on foot. Each step carried pain. Each hour allowed the injury to worsen. Without proper treatment, the wound began to change. Swelling increased. Movement became more difficult. The arm once injured became stiff, then discolored. Still, he moved. Along roads crowded with others, through villages already abandoned or destroyed. Past vehicles left behind due to lack of fuel. The war was ending, but for those inside it, the final phase was chaotic. Survival depended on reaching somewhere safer, somewhere organized, somewhere that still functioned. For many, that place became the advancing Allied lines. Word spread quickly among retreating soldiers. American camps offered treatment, food, stability, for a wounded soldier whose condition was worsening. The risk of surrender began to outweigh the certainty of continued deterioration. So they moved toward those lines. The young soldier was one of them. By the time he reached the American camp, the journey had already taken its toll. The injury had progressed beyond its early stage. The damage was visible. And the medics who saw him understood immediately they were not treating a recent wound. They were confronting the final stage of something that had been allowed to grow unchecked. Inside the medical tent, the next moments would determine whether the war would end for him as a survivor or as another casualty of delay. Inside the medical tent, the examination becomes immediate. The young soldier is seated. His sleeve is cut open. The fabric falls away from the arm. The damage is clear. The skin is darkened from the forearm downward. Patches of black spread unevenly across the surface. In some areas, the tissue appears dry and lifeless. In others, swelling suggests deeper infection beneath the surface. A medic leans closer. The smell confirms what the eyes already suggest: advanced infection. The doctor begins the assessment. He checks for a pulse along the wrist. Weak. Barely detectable. He presses gently along the arm. The soldier reacts in some areas, but not in others. Loss of sensation. Another sign. The medics work quickly, not hurried but efficient. In wartime medicine, hesitation costs lives. The doctor traces the arm upward, searching for the boundary. Where does the damage stop? Where does living tissue begin? Because everything below that line is already lost. The diagnosis forms without discussion. Severe gangrene? The risk is no longer confined to the arm. If bacteria enter the bloodstream, the infection will spread. At that point, survival becomes uncertain. The decision is clear. Amputation is necessary. Not as a last resort, but as the only option remaining. Preparation begins immediately. Instruments are laid out. Antiseptic solutions are prepared. Bandages are organized in advance. Anesthesia is measured carefully. The soldier is weak. His body has already endured days of stress, pain, and infection. Too much anesthetic could be dangerous. Too little would leave him conscious of the procedure. The medics move with precision. They have done this before. But each case remains personal. Because every patient represents a moment where time has already been lost, then where what remains must be protected. The doctor marks the point of incision. Above the damaged tissue, into the area where circulation still exists. The goal is not perfection. It is survival. Once the procedure begins, everything narrows. The tent continues to function around them, other patients being treated, orders being given, equipment being moved, but within the surgical space, focus becomes absolute. Infected tissue is removed. Bleeding is controlled. The remaining limb is cleaned thoroughly. Every step is designed to prevent the infection from spreading further. Time passes without notice. Then the procedure ends. The immediate danger has been reduced. But the outcome is not yet certain. The soldier is moved to recovery. His arm is bandaged. His body begins the next stage not of war, but of healing. Outside, the final weeks of the conflict continue to unfold. Inside the tent, another kind of battle has been fought. And whether it has been won will depend on what happens in the hours and days that follow. After surgery, the pace changes. The urgency of the operation gives way to observation. The young soldier is placed on a stretcher in the recovery section of the tent. His arm, now bandaged above the point of removal, is secured carefully to prevent further strain. Blankets are pulled tightly around him to maintain body temperature. For patients in this condition, the first hours are critical. The body has endured more than just injury. It has endured infection, exhaustion, and now surgery. Medics begin monitoring immediately. Pulse, breathing, skin temperature. Each sign is checked repeatedly. Fluids are administered to support circulation. Small amounts of water are given once the soldier is stable enough. Antibiotics, now available in Allied supplier, used to control any remaining infection. The goal is clear: prevent the spread, support recovery, stabilize the body before complications emerge. Inside the tent, the routine continues. Other patients arrive. Other injuries are treated. The war has not yet fully ended, and the flow of wounded continues. But cases like this remain in the awareness of the medical staff, because they represent a different kind of challenge, not the immediate trauma of battle, but the delayed consequences of a system that failed before help could arrive. Hours pass, then more. The soldier's condition begins to stabilize. His breathing becomes more regular. His pulse steadies. There are no immediate signs of infection spreading further. For the medics, these are the indicators they look for. Small changes, gradual improvement, signs that the body is responding. Recovery will take time, days, weeks, possibly longer. But survival, at least for now, has been secured. And as similar cases continue arriving at Allied camps across Germany, the pattern becomes clearer. The war is ending. But the damage it has left behind is still being treated one patient at a time. In the weeks following Germany's surrender in May 1945, the cases arriving at Allied medical facilities began to form a pattern. It was not limited to one camp or one region. Across Western Germany, American medical units reported similar findings: wounded soldiers and civilians arriving with injuries that had been left untreated for far too long, broken limbs that had healed incorrectly, infections that had spread beyond control, burns that had never been properly dressed. Doctors documented these cases carefully. Their reports described not only the injuries themselves, but the conditions that had allowed them to worsen. Again and again, the same factors appeared: destroyed infrastructure, lack of transportation, shortages of medicine, overwhelmed or non-functioning hospitals. Even when medical facilities existed, reaching them had become difficult or impossible. For many wounded individuals, the only option had been to move on their own, to walk, to endure, to wait, and in that waiting, injuries changed. What might have been treated in hours became something that developed over days or weeks. By the time Allied forces encountered these patients, the original wound was often no longer the primary concern. It was the infection, the spread, the damage that could no longer be reversed. The young soldier with the blackened arm was one example among many. His condition reflected a broader reality in Army, and a society that had reached a point where it could no longer sustain even basic care for its wounded. For Allied medics, these encounters altered their understanding of the final phase of the war. Germany had long been seen as a powerful military opponent. But inside the medical tents, that image shifted. They were now treating individuals who had been left behind by their own system. Young soldiers, civilians, people who had been caught in the collapse, rather than directing it. Medical care did not distinguish between them. Treatment was based on condition, not identity. This approach created moments where the boundaries of war blurred. The enemy became the patient. The battlefield became a place of intervention rather than conflict. And in those moments, the reality of the war's end became clearer. Victory was not only defined by territory gained or armies defeated, it was defined by what remained. The wounded, the survivors, and the effort required to rebuild lives after a system had failed. Wars are often measured in territory, in cities captured, in armies defeated, in the final signatures that bring conflict to an official end. But the deeper cost of war is rarely found on maps. It is found in the body, in the wound that was not treated in time, in the infection that spread quietly, day by day, in the moment when survival depends not on victory, but on intervention. In the spring of 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed, millions of stories unfolded across Europe. Some ended in battle. Others ended in surrender. And many continued in places far removed from the front lines inside medical tents, where the consequences of the war were measured in pulse, breath, and recovery. The young German soldier who arrived with a blackened arm carried more than an injury. He carried the final stage of a system that had failed before he reached help. For the doctors who treated him, the war briefly shifted. It was no longer about opposing armies. It was about a single life, a decision made under pressure, a chance to stop what had already gone too far. And in that moment, the meaning of the war changed. Not as a contest of nations, but as the fragile effort to save what remained after everything else had fallen apart.